Peta Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Great to have your company. Here's what's coming up on the show tonight. Well, I remained silent this week, but tonight I'm going to give you my take on the ABC's Nemesis documentary. Now, I refused to take part because it was nothing more than a rogue's gallery of egos from the very people who brought down a fine Prime Minister. But there are some glaring errors and omissions, and a fair bit glossed over too, and we'll set the record straight tonight. Peter Dutton has labelled Penny Wong's position as untenable. If there's any evidence she had advice that Palestinian aid would end up in the hands of Hamas, but it could already be more serious than that. I'll speak with an international criminal lawyer who says the Australian government might have broken its own anti-terrorism laws. Plus, Chris Bowen speaking out of both sides of his mouth, more than happy to tout his green agenda, but behind the scenes, more than $100 million of your money he's spending to keep coal alive. Now, what's going on here? These green targets, they're just not tenable. And you and I know it, but Labor's betrayals won't end at those stage 3 tax cuts. Finance Minister Katie Gallagher this morning unable to rule out changes to negative gearing.
Would you mind repeating after me? There will be no changes to negative gearing under my government.
Well, it's not my government, it's the Albanese government, and we have no plans on negative gearing.
But first, working as a Prime Minister's Chief of Staff was the best time of my life. The best job I've ever had and am likely to ever had. But seeing that PM unjustly turfed from his office was the worst, especially as I was collateral damage in Malcolm Turnbull's campaign to seize the country's top job that he could never have won fair and square in a general election. Because it was so painful, I've hardly ever spoken about it publicly. Now, sure, I talk about politics and policy every night here with you, but not this. However, as I watched the ABC's Nemesis program on Monday night, it all came back. So after 10 years of holding it all in, I wrote about how that felt in my column today for The Australian. As I wrote, partly traumatic was reliving the trauma, but also cathartic in a way to see the anti-Abbott plotters finally exposed for what they were and still are. And I want to share with you some of that response. You and my Sky News family, I want to talk to you tonight. Now, to its credit, the ABC largely let some of the key people tell their own story. Yes, the ABC still got to decide what they put to air and what ended up on the cutting room floor, but no one put the words into the mouths of these MPs. And it's their words on Monday night that condemned them and helped Australians outside of politics see what I saw inside it at its grubby, tawdry worst. Apparently, both Turnbull and Scott Morrison each gave some 8 hours of reflections and responses to the ABC. Tony Abbott, well, he declined to be involved because he said he didn't want to rake over old coals. He didn't want to be trapped into bad-mouthing colleagues, and he felt he'd more than dealt with the ups and downs of his government on camera in press conferences at the time. So the ABC found the old Abbott footage to tell his side of the story. Now, what was on display on Monday night was a Prime Minister doing his best to run the country, to stop the boats, to fix the budget, to scrap the taxes and to build the new roads our country then needed, while being undermined and sabotaged from the very beginning by some of his so-called colleagues. The revolving door Prime Ministership with Turnbull and Morrison first machinating against Abbott and then Morrison machinating against Turnbull was what made a period of coalition government that should have been as good as John Howard's scarcely much better than Malcolm Fraser's. A tragedy for our country, an embarrassment to the Liberal Party and a disgrace, especially to the two men in particular who put their own advancement ahead of the long-term national interest and your interests, your family's interests. As Turnbull had earlier revealed in his memoirs, but this time he repeated it on camera, he and Morrison, he said, first started plotting the removal of Abbott from the Prime Ministership even before Abbott's landslide win in 2013. By midway through 2014, the organising and the backroom dealing was well underway. Here's Turnbull from Monday night.
Scott was loudly proclaiming his loyalty to Tony Abbott and at the same time organising his supporters to vote for me. And we had an understanding that if I became Prime Minister, he would be Treasurer.
And here's Morrison's shifty and unconvincing response.
No, I don't recall Malcolm offering me Treasurer before. I don't recall that. I don't know where that's from. I was not a protagonist in this.
Meanwhile, the campaign to politically assassinate the man who'd brought them all back into government in record time picked up pace. Here is a bloke who only entered Parliament after his millionaire dad called on Abbott and said, please help my son get a seat, and who then later quit that seat after Turnbull was ousted in 2018.
Malcolm is normally, a really confident, gregarious person. But I was watching him, and as it became apparent that we had the numbers, he really went back into his shell. He got really quiet and nervous. It was like the penny was dropping for him that this was now a go.
But the Turnbull forces only succeeded because the Morrison numbers were with them.
I was getting phone calls from various, what you'd call, warlords from New South Wales who were pushing the need for Tony to go. There's no way that I would be receiving phone calls from those individuals in New South Wales unless they were doing that with the approval of their political master. It's as simple as that.
And that master was Scott Morrison.
I assume that their master is Scott Morrison.
If only Abbott had been allowed to get on with the job the coalition was elected to do, we'd have had a budget surplus, Japanese submarines, a much better managed welfare system, tax and federation reform, and a much better managed immigration program. As well as border control, the budget repair, an end to the carbon tax, mining tax, those three big trade deals and the infrastructure boom that actually got done from just 2 years of the Abbott government. And a Prime Minister too, prepared to stand up to President Putin over that MH17 atrocity and send troops to help the fight against Islamic State and more. As I said, such a waste and tragedy for our country. Once Abbott was gone, the government was more Labor light than centre right. And it wasn't just that the government got worse. For several years, we got a dreadful culture of leaking and backstabbing and the politics of personal destruction.
It's fair to say that you win at that point in time, and there's the euphoria of having done it, the fact that we think, hey, let's get this show back on the road. But what you don't appreciate is the depth of anger of some of those in the room and the lengths they will go to as time moves forward to exact revenge and retribution.
When he says win there, he's not talking about winning an election fair and square. He's talking about winning the numbers in a party room coup. Now, it's worth setting the record straight now on a couple of issues from that time. The 2014 budget, well, Abbott had been explicit in the election campaign and before it that the coalition would not support the Gillard cash splash on schools, hospitals, which were all beyond the then forward estimates. The money didn't exist. And history shows that the total spending on health and education continued to increase, yes, increase under Abbott, only at a slower and more sustainable rate than before. Abbott was just following the Hawke government precedent and seeking a modest co-payment on GP visits and extending an earlier Labor move to raise the pension age and to reduce the indexation rates for some social security benefits. Seeking to have school leavers learn or earn rather than just go on the dole was a worthy bid to break the something-for-nothing mindset that's so contrary to who we are as Australians. And there was nothing sneaky or underhand about how he handled same-sex marriage. Abbott always said that if it came up in the 2013 parliamentary term, it would be dealt with in the normal way by the coalition party room, which it was. Indeed, he specifically discussed putting the issue to a plebiscite with a key frontbencher, the same frontbencher I might add, who subsequently claimed it was all a surprise to him. He put it to him at a dinner in Adelaide a few weeks earlier. Now, I know because I was there. As Abbott said at the time, people's attitude to marriage is so personal that it should be decided directly by them rather than by MPs. And that, he thought, would mean that whatever the outcome, Australians would accept it without rancour. Now, he was right. Resolving this issue via the plebiscite that Turnbull had opposed actually turned out to be one of the few achievements of the Turnbull government. Now, with time to reflect, it's now clear that one of the key differences between our public life in the Hawke and Howard era and more recently has been the decline in personal character. Our best recent PMs were able to succeed because big egos with different policy positions were much readier to buckle down and support the government and the leader of the day. Most of them saw public life in terms of service to the nation rather than personal advancement, and didn't let resentments get the better of them if they were never put into cabinet or even if they never got past the backbench. Perhaps the most dispiriting aspect of Nemesis' first episode was the credibility it gave to a raft of MPs smarting at Abbott's move to end family members being employed by the father or the son or the mother or the wife. So the kids and the wife on your expense in their office, or first class overseas travel. After having a ringside seat at the self-destruction of the Rudd-Gillard government, I never thought that the coalition would indulge in an action replay. Now, I always knew Turnbull would try and come for Abbott one day, but I didn't think MPs would buy the carpetbagger spiel in the first term, especially after his patent failures as opposition leader. Now, like Abbott, I declined to appear in the program because I was certain of a selective and distorted version of my response to the usual crap that I was too tough. Too tough on entitlements, they said. Well, I tell you, what's the alternative? Lose ministers in a first term like the Howard government did? The complaint that MPs couldn't get to Abbott? Come on. You couldn't use a mobile phone? You couldn't walk around to his office or perhaps buttonhole him after question time? That I was too outspoken with ministers? Well, isn't that what you pay advisors to do? Speak their mind, not just meekly agree? Now, I served as a political staffer for 16 years because I believe in the Liberal Party's values. Perfect? No one is. But I was loyal, absolutely loyal, and always working for the government, not trying to undermine it. That's why it hurts so much to see the party used by carpetbaggers and careerists who should never have been given the honour of Liberal Party pre-selection in the first place. And in the process, to have my own reputation attacked. The reputation for policy and procedural smarts that I'd earned in the Howard years and all the way through opposition. And the grudging recognition that a woman on my side of the aisle could be just as good as the blokes when it came to political campaigning. Everything was used against me. Even my years on IVF by lowlifes like Clive Palmer. As I said today, some days I honestly don't know how I managed to survive. And I mean that literally. A big part of what helped me keep my head together was never wanting the haters to succeed. While we don't agree on so many things, I'll never forget the humanity of Bill Shorten and later Anthony Albanese, who both quietly and privately reached out to me to express their disgust at my treatment. This wasn't blows from Labor. This was my own side. Julia Gillard and Julie Bishop, well, as I wrote today, maybe that card's still in the mail. One of the reasons I'm now in the public square is to let people who have heard the criticisms take a closer look at me and make up your own mind. Being here each night and it's your support that's made my show #1 on this channel for the past 3 years, is my answer to those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Those lines are magnificent prose by Teddy Roosevelt. It's called The Man in the Arena, and it's what helped keep me sane. Well, now that Morrison has joined Turnbull in exiting the Parliament, my hope is for an end to the self-serving duplicity of recent years, so that the next coalition government can be so much better than the last. All right, headlines now. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. Anthony Albanese says he won't horse trade with the Greens to get his tax changes through Parliament. Adam Bandt wants a boost to job seeker payments. That's on top of his call to lift the income tax-free threshold and add dental to Medicare.
What we won't be doing is trading across different issues. We're focused on this. This stands on its merits.
But more support for those on welfare is not off the table.
That's something you'd be considering in the May budget.
Jim and I have said every budget we look at what we can do to ease cost of living pressures across the board. So I think we've shown that we are prepared to look, and we have looked at how we can make sure that people who are doing it tough are supported.
Health Minister Mark Butler says he thinks Australians won't be disappointed with the government's COVID inquiry, despite it not being a royal commission. Policy experts say they want a royal commission into the pandemic response. They are concerned the government's special inquiry won't be robust enough.
The reason why we've had a royal commission into the robo-debt crisis, as was promised by the Albanese opposition, but not a royal commission into the pandemic where 15,000 to 20,000 Australians possibly died, is because of politics.
And the states and territories' role won't be scrutinised properly.
The Royal Commission needs to be established jointly by federal and state governments so that it is able to examine a pandemic response that was characterised and driven by complex interactions between different levels of government.
The Health Minister downplaying the concerns, saying the inquiry will be sufficient.
The stuff that was initiated by state governments, the broad lockdown arrangements, density requirements, all of those sorts of things are going to be considered deeply by this COVID inquiry.
Well, that tax cut brokered promise is just not going away, despite how much Labor might want us all to forget their deception.
My word is my bond. I can confirm that we haven't changed our position. We have no change to our plans. Tax cuts will happen in July.
And now it's another day today of negative gearing in the spotlight. On Monday, of course, the Treasurer said the government had no plans to change it. And today, this from his colleague, the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher.
I can tell you we've done no work, we have no plans on negative gearing, and when our position has changed, we've fronted up and been clear about that.
All right, let's get in those headlines with my panel. Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild, and media writer for The Australian, Sophie Ellsworth. Well, those words, no plans, give themselves away. He said it on Monday, the Treasurer. She is the Finance Minister, let's not forget. No plans means they can come up with plans at any time in the future.
That's right. We've heard all this before, and I don't think there's any doubt that there'll be more changes to the tax system, whether that's before the election or a plan to take it to the election remains to be seen. There's a couple of things here, Peter, and we touched on this last week. It's clear that Labor feels that it's unshackled from any election promises now.
Yep.
But so too is the coalition in an interesting way. And they now have an opportunity to untether themselves from these stage 3 tax cuts. Important though as they were, politically they're dead. That's not to say that they shouldn't advocate for tax cuts for low to middle or for higher income earners, but they now need to understand that there's an opportunity to broaden out their offerings to middle Australia through comprehensive tax reform. We talked about family income tax splitting, indexing the tax brackets, a sizable cut for small to medium enterprises. Those kind of offerings, I think, would make much more difference to the day-to-day experience of mainstream Australians than the fairly modest, but nonetheless welcome offering of Albanese. But the other thing to remember here, Peter, is none of this would be happening in the absence of the massive voice defeat, because it was lower income working class Labor voters that deserted Albanese. He's now trying to win them back, and it's up to, I think, the coalition to present an offering to those people.
I couldn't agree with you more on that point. I mean, the other conundrum here is you've got the Greens, they've got a raft of changes they want. They want a blood price here now. They know Labor have to get these changes through. They have to amend that legislation that was to come in on the 1st of July. And of course, the Greens have got their wish list. But Albanese is vulnerable because half of what the Greens want is supported by Labor's own party room.
It's going to be really interesting, isn't it, Peter, to see how it plays out. But obviously the Greens don't like anyone getting ahead, so they're not going to want the coalition's changes, to, legislated changes to, roll on as they were. But this has put Albanese in a predicament. And as Daniel said, they're desperate to win back these low to middle income earners because the Voice was such a disaster. They know they're in trouble. So now they're trying to appease the public by saying, look, we're going to give you more money to those lower income earners than the coalition would have.
What do you make of that noise around today? 1.7 million Australians are in the gun of Treasury, meaning the government. These are people who have got some sort of trust. It might be farmers with trusts. It might be families with a trust. We're talking about $60 billion. They had this in the kick in 2019 at the election. Of course, Labor did win that election, but it hasn't gone away, has it?
No, that's right. You mentioned farmers and also small businesses often use this as a mechanism for multi-generational planning, so they'll be hit by any changes. The real interesting thing, Peter, and I was sort of thinking about this, I haven't heard the Prime Minister or the Treasurer talk about growth. They don't have a growth plan, they have a redistribution plan, but there's no plan for how to grow the economy. And there's a mentality of this Labor government that you can only make one group of people better off by making another group of people worse off. Now, if you want to grow the revenue that the government has, the best way to do that is to grow the economy as a whole without having to increase the tax rates there within. So I think that Peter Dutton on 2GB today was spot on when he said basically this is a very divisive government, and rather than putting forward an agenda to grow the economy in the national interest, it's seeking to divide it and redistribute. And so I think the next 12 months will bear that out.
Budget estimates have revealed some, pretty ridiculous spending in the Education Department. None of this is improving our schools, of course, but you've got thousands of dollars on welcome to country ceremonies. You've got really high-end, pricey restaurants where public servants are flashing the nation's credit card. This is the sort of stuff that really angers people, doesn't it, Sophie?
Absolutely, Peter. It's woke bureaucrats are spending money like drunken sailors, and it's our money, taxpayers' money, that they're spending. This never passed the pub test. Why are they having welcome to countries at meetings, and why are they going to lavish restaurants and having expensive dinners? They should be on a really tight budget and showing Australians that they too are curbing their costs while the rest of us are watching our bottom lines.
I've got to ask you about Lydia Thorpe's uncle, the activist Robbie Thorpe. He's now camping out in King's Domain, which, if you're not a Melburnian's, a big park, public park.
Yep.
He says he wants that land to be given back to the Aboriginal local people. He did it before about 18 years ago. He sort of got nowhere, but the world's very different now. To me, it has the real stink, Daniel, of what we've seen in the tent embassy in Canberra. So it starts small. More and more activists will join him, and I have no confidence the state government or the Melbourne City Council is going to move him now.
I agree. London to a brick, they're not going to do it. And this is a real test for Melbourne City Council. I think they're one of the worst, if not the worst, councils in the nation. Just walk around Melbourne CBD, you will know what I mean. And this is a test whether they believe in equality before the law. If you or I or Sophie were to set up shop there, guaranteed we'd be moved out quick, fast. And so we should be, because it's, as you say, public land, but because of the claimed racial sensitivities and probably the indigeneity of the parties involved, at a minimum they will go slow. But I think you're right that this could quite easily end up being a semi-permanent setup like they have in Canberra. So this is a test for the Lord Mayor and the Deputy Mayor of Melbourne City Council. Will you stand up for equality of the citizens of Melbourne, or are you going to place and give special treatment to one group based on their race?
We'll come back to that, I guarantee you. There'll be more than just Robbie Thorpe there in a few days' time. Thank you both. Right, earlier this week, the government belatedly put a pause on that funding for UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinians, amid serious allegations that staff were linked to the October 7 terror attacks. Now, there's been concerns about this agency for a long time, but that hasn't stopped Australia funneling some $200 million their way over the past decade. But it gets worse. With a Hamas-listed terror organisation, of course Hamas was listed a couple of years ago, there are concerns that via UNRWA we have perhaps breached our own anti-terrorism laws. For more on this, I'm joined now by military lawyer, former legal advisor to the New South Wales Police Counter-Terrorism Command, Dr. Glenn Colometes. Glenn, thank you for your time. Take us through this timeline. What do we know?
Peter, we've had these terror laws since 2002. Of course, October 7 last year, we saw the terror attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians. 2 months later, the government was advised by a delegation from 30 Jewish organisations that UNRWA was linked to Hamas. And I understand, as you touched on in your opening, the government was on notice much earlier that that UNRWA incites terrorism, including in its schools. The government nonetheless went ahead and committed further funds to UNRWA. Now, since then, Israel's identified 12 UNRWA members who are directly taking part in the atrocities on October 7. And we're now seeing more evidence come into light that as to the extent of UNRWA's incitement to terrorism, to terrorist acts in their schools, so inciting young Palestinians to terror acts. And I guess finally, it's been reported that Penny Wong herself discussed UNRWA's educational material with the UNRWA head while she was in Israel recently.
So if she was warned, if she had official advice internally, if she was warned by delegations from other governments, including Jewish Australians or particularly, in this case, Israeli government officials, and she didn't listen, they didn't take the threat seriously, is that where they'll have this breach against our obligations?
That goes to it, Peter, absolutely. I suspect it's a matter of willful blindness that they were given advice but chose not to exercise due diligence, not to dig deeper and look into the advice, in order to avoid obtaining actual knowledge, so further knowledge of the terror risk. And of course, willful blindness is recklessness, and recklessness is an element of this particular terror funding offence. So, Peter, that absolutely goes to the offending.
I want to play for you some comments from Opposition Leader Peter Dutton today, because he said her position is untenable if these reports are true. Have a listen.
I believe that Penny Wong's position is untenable if it's demonstrated that she had advice that this money could be used for a purpose that wasn't intended by the government. That is an outrage because, firstly, it's taxpayers' money. It's against our national interest.
Glenn, do you agree?
Peter, I've seen some of the footage of the October 7 attacks recorded by Hamas terrorists themselves. I cried, then I got very, very angry to the point that, Peter, if Penny Wong is even contemplating a return to funding this organisation, by Australia, then to my view, she cannot possibly represent us on the world stage.
Wow. They are tough words from a bloke who is a sober judge in this area, Dr. Glenn Colometes. Thank you for your time. All right, after the break, our Defence Force is so underprepared that we're actually talking about using, wait for it, killer eagles to bring down drones. I am not making this up. Plus, an important reminder of what happens when the media and left-wing government set their sights on someone. I'll discuss the horrible treatment of Cardinal Pell with someone who has literally written the book. Welcome back. Hypocritical Chris Bowen. I tell you what, funding a coal-fired steel plant at the same time trying to demonise it. But first, I have to return to something I've been reporting all week because it's truly concerning. Today, we've learned that we're at least 8 years behind for our soldiers to be protected from killer drones. Defence is apparently mulling over its options, one of which, now I said you will not believe this, is training eagles to fly in and take out drones. Now, seriously, we're behind our allies years and years. More concerningly, we're behind those that want to do us harm. Yet on almost every military front, there's no sense of urgency with the government or the Defence Department. Joining me now is someone who knows this inside out, former Defence official, current Head of Research at Strategic Analysis Australia, Marcus Hellyer. Marcus, thank you for your time. I want to laugh about the Eagles, but it's concerning. It's terrible, right? It's not a joke. These drones, we can see them play out in the Middle East, and we're still, running around with whiteboards. Why aren't they already here? Why don't we have them in operation? And why are we so far behind?
Well, that's a great question, Peter. It is true there are countries looking at using various birds of prey to take out drones. I'm not sure that's Defence's only option they're looking at. I think they are looking at a broad range of options. But I think that's the heart of the problem here. Defence spends all of its time looking at options, exploring the potential perfect solution, and never actually committing to doing anything, which is kind of bizarre because there are great Australian companies today that are making drones and counter-drone systems and are providing them to Ukraine. They are being used every day on the front lines in Ukraine with great success, and yet our Defence Force is not buying them.
I used to work for a Defence Minister in the Howard government years, and what always staggered me, we'd see something in operation with one of our allies. We'd discuss at a political level, MP to MP, about saying, well, why don't we get that in operation in Australia? And sure enough, our Defence Department, the bureaucrats, would add hundreds of millions of dollars to the price that our allies were paying, but they always wanted to make it Australian special. So they'd sort of, basically buggerise the plans and the design and add all these years to it when we could have had it off the shelf from an ally in half the time and half the money.
Yes, we're very good at doing that, Australianising things and putting extra requirements on. I mean, if you look at the Hunter-class frigate program, that's a classic case where the cost and schedule and technical risk has blown out because we've fundamentally changed the design of that British warship. But we could go and buy off-the-shelf stuff right now, whether from an ally or from Australian companies making great drone systems or counter-drone systems. And it's very perplexing. I mean, the previous government, as you well know, had 9 years to kind of break Defence out of its bad habits of, obsessively analysing things and never making a decision, and only had limited success. And the current government is encountering exactly the same problem. Even though it did the Defence Strategic Review last year, which said Defence has to change the way it does business, it needs to accept more risk, it needs to move faster, we still seem to be in exactly the same situation. And that document you referred to earlier with the potential Eagles as counter-drone systems, the schedule in that document said that the Army's not going to get counter-drone systems until well into the 2030s. So we are, in Defence's plan, we are still a decade away to acquire technologies that exist now. And I really don't think that's good enough. Why are we not sending a frigate to the Red Sea? Well, one reason is that it doesn't have good counter-drone technologies on it. So, it is already having an effect on the ADF, and it's having an effect on Australia's ability to be a good partner to its allies.
Well, I want to congratulate you, Marcus, on exposing all of this stuff and working with Ben Packham in The Australian today, because we have got to keep the pressure up. Technology is changing so rapidly and we're already left behind. So keep up the good work, keep up the pressure, and let's hope we see some changes. Marcus Hellyer, thank you for your time. All right, let's go to some other issues now. It's about 12 months on now after we all witnessed those shocking media pile-on attacks against the late Cardinal George Pell, led by the ABC's Louise Milligan and a whole lot of others that saw him deny the presumption of innocence. And of course, about 12 months ago now, we buried Cardinal Pell. He unjustly spent 13 months in prison before his conviction for historical child sexual assault allegations was unanimously quashed by the full bench of the High Court. Until his death, he believed that he'd been targeted by corrupt forces in Rome in response to his clean-up of the Vatican's finances. Gerard Henderson documented the hostile media campaign in his book, Cardinal Pell, The Media Pylon and Collective Guilt, and has just released a new edition. The author, Gerard Henderson, head of the Sydney Institute as well, joins me now. Gerard, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I mentioned that we're 12 months on from the death of what I regard as a great man. Why is it so important we need to revisit this media pylon against the late Cardinal?
Well, I think he was important. He was the most important churchman in Australian history. I think that's true to say. He was an international figure. He had people who disliked him. He had people who liked him. But I think the important point is that he was a great Christian leader, not just to Catholics. And I went to his requiem in Sydney, and I noticed there that it was a very multicultural audience, attendance, congregation, and that reflected his broad support among all kinds of Christians from all kinds of places. And he sort of predicted that the Australian Catholic Church would become a multicultural church, would become essentially an Asian church plus some others in it, and that's what's happened. So he was a great figure, but I think the other part of it is that this is one of the most important criminal cases in Australian history, that what you had was a campaign against George Pell, led by essentially the Victorian legal system, with a big pile-on by mainly the ABC and The Age in Melbourne, the ABC office in Melbourne, The Age, the Saturday paper, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Guardian Australia, they all led it. But the essential point was that he was charged by Victoria Police on 26 charges. Not one of them got up. So the Victoria Police went down 26 zip, and they then said it was a success. The Director of Public Prosecutions in 2 cases could not explain the case. I go into all this in my book with heavy documentation. When it got to the High Court, the Director of Public Prosecutions for Victoria couldn't explain the case and performed abysmally. And then the High Court of Australia, in a 7-zip decision, overthrew the majority judgment of Victoria's Chief Justice and the President of the Victorian Court of Appeal. There was a brilliant dissent in the Court of Appeal by Justice Mark Weinberg, which is one of the greatest judgments in Australian legal history.
I agree.
And the High Court essentially upheld Justice Weinberg's dissent. So you've got a real pile-on, and what's really required here, if Victoria is serious about its legal system, there should be some inquiry into how this case went so badly and how Victoria ends up in the dreadfully embarrassing position of virtually all its legal system being defeated 7-zip in the High Court.
What about the ABC, though, and the media side of things at Media Pylon? I agree with you. I think what we saw transpire both through the police and the Victorian legal system is terrifying. There will be someone else after Cardinal Pell subjected to this sort of punishment through the media. But what about the ABC? Because people like Louise Milligan, they still have all their awards over books and programs about Cardinal Pell. Well, 7-zip in the High Court says they were wrong.
Well, I understand, I've heard that Louise Milligan's next book's a book of fiction, but you could say that the book on Cardinal Pell was a book of fiction. It just doesn't stand up. But it wasn't just Louise Milligan, although there was Sarah Ferguson, there was Paul Kennedy, there were Michael Rowland, there was a whole heap of them. And what the ABC wouldn't do was to hear alternative views. I was never asked on the ABC. Frank Brennan has got a book out, like a recent new edition, like my new edition. The ABC won't discuss any matters with Frank Brennan or myself. So what you've got here is an act of censorship, which is totally unprofessional. And in my book, I list 120 journalists who are in the anti-Pell pylon, who were Pell antagonists. 40 of them are ABC journalists. They're all criticised. Not one of them has come back to me and said I've got anything wrong, but not one of them will discuss what I've said on the ABC where I've been deplatformed. So I don't care myself. I've got other platforms. But it says something terrible about the taxpayer-funded public broadcaster, that it won't engage in any kind of debate on a controversial issue where it's got it hopelessly wrong.
All right, well, if you care about how the media treats big issues, please get hold of Gerard's book. Gerard Henderson, thank you for your time. Doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or even a Christian, but you should care about how people are treated in the media. When the courts say 7-zip, that's not true. All right, after the break. Chris Bowen talking out of both sides of his mouth. There's no surprises there. But more on that ABC doco from the Abbott era, from someone else who was there, who worked up close and personal with Malcolm Turnbull, but she had the sense to quit Canberra. After the break. Well, it seems even Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen's beginning to realise his green dream's a bit of a fantasy. We've learned he's committed millions in funding an upgrade to a blast furnace at the Port Kembla Steelworks, despite his push to phase out fossil fuels. Joining me now to discuss this, the Australian's Environment Editor, Graham Lloyd. I love calling the pot kettle black here. Taxpayers, I bet you they don't know he's spending $137 million of their money to keep coal alive. At the very same time, he's demonising it.
That's right. Good evening, Peter. Well, this is the back to the future redistributive politics of the carbon tax. You introduce a punitive regime to tell companies to lower their emissions or spend money, and then you have to pick the ones that you favour and run around and subsidise them to stay in business and keep the jobs. The big admission really in this, one is that taxpayers are on the hook again, but secondly, the Blue Scope is made it pretty clear that this transition to fossil fuel-free production is a bit of a pipe dream. It's still 20 years away at least. They're taking money now to really renovate the existing production process, and they're going to stick with it for a long time to come.
Look, and I hope they do. I mean, I look around the world, look how dangerous our region is. We need to make, big steel projects in Australia. We don't want to go to war with China and have to import, our ships and all our steel from China. It won't turn up. But this is crazy. I want to ask you, though, now about this Victorian government energy upgrades scheme. It was meant to get Victoria down to all of its ridiculous net zero goals, but it's a debacle. What's going on down there?
Well, this is another example of repeating the mistakes of the past. That's really the epitome was the insulation scheme in the Rudd government, where you put out a whole load of government money to encourage people to do things, and you end up getting a load of carpetbaggers come in to seize the government money. So this scheme started out with light bulbs and other small value items, and it's suddenly been expanded to fridges and cooktops and other things worth a great deal of money. So people will come to farm the system. The credits become more important than the commodities, and it's all a huge mess. The cost to consumers is that all these certificates have to be purchased by the power producers, and that cost is passed on to consumers. Whether there's any benefit for the environment or for households or people at large is a really moot point.
It's a joke, Graham Lloyd. Thank you. All right, let's go to my panel now. Liberal MP Nicole Flint, Shadow Assistant Defence Minister, Liberal MP too, Phil Thompson. Welcome to you both. I'll start with you, Nicole Flint, with the ABC's distorted Nemesis documentary. I wrote about it today in The Australian. I spoke about it at the top of the show tonight. But my viewers might not know, we worked together, you and I, in the Brendan Nelson office. He, of course, was the leader of the Liberal Party right after the loss of the 2007 election. And then we worked together briefly in the Turnbull office until you had the good sense to resign. What did you make of the revelations on the ABC this week about Turnbull and Morrison, and in particular Turnbull saying that he was plotting for months and months with with Morrison to bring down Abbott?
Well, if this is true, it's absolutely deeply disappointing, Peter. But leaving that aside, what the ABC has done, and they've done us a favour, is expose Malcolm Turnbull for the person that he is. He is a wrecker. He hurt the nation, he hurt the Liberal Party, and he hurt two wonderful leaders, Brendan Nelson and Tony Abbott, and brought down two Liberal Party leaders for his own ego and ambition. And I hope everybody does watch. I don't say this often, Peter, but I hope everyone does watch the ABC documentary so they can really see who Malcolm Turnbull is. He deserves to be remembered as one of our worst ever prime ministers on both sides of Parliament, or, both parties. And I really hope that this helps to expose him and his true character.
I think it also helps expose Scott Morrison and how much he was up to his eyeballs in it from day one, despite how he's tried to present the facts since. I think that's also the big takeout for me, and it is interesting. Phil, I won't put you on the spot. I'll get you onto more important things. I think that this is a bit of navel-gazing going back over the future, but I think it's a lesson to those who support the Liberal Party. You cannot let your party, you can't let leadership go down this path ever again. But just on the issue I'm concerned about today, if I think of all the things this week, Phil, that upset me the most reading the paper, that I think this is diabolic, the warning coming out from the United States to all these Pacific nations saying do not use Chinese-made technology in your undersea cables. I thought, my God, are we seriously having to warn them? Is there that risk that they will spend money on Huawei or Chinese cabling? Because, of course, that's how we have our security conversations around the world in many instances. You and I know a lot of stuff on those undersea cables is incredibly important, but it's also how we stay connected. I mean, if the internet went down around the world, would be all sorts of trouble. And we know the FBI has got all these warnings about Chinese hackers. This is huge.
Yeah, it is. And I would think if China had their way, that all the Pacific nations would allow China to be involved and to use their products, which essentially would put everyone at risk, the United States as well as us, as the Pacific's on our doorstep. I think it's a nice warning from the States, and we should also be encouraging our Pacific friends not to use Chinese products. We've had to get cameras out of government buildings that were made in China because of the security risk. We've seen what's happened in places like the Solomon Islands when they've had civil unrest. China wants to rock up with lots of money but they want to take more than they give. And I think that we being leaders in this region, but also very close to our Pacific friends, we should be encouraging them to stick away from the Chinese stuff, because it's no good. And they don't play by the rules, and they'll do everything they can to undermine the world's security and undermine our national security.
Nick Flint, two things that have sort of collided a bit today. I was reading a report that a major donor to Harvard, and when I say major, this is someone who's handed over $500 million plus to the university. Well, this donor stopped funding them. He says these elite institutions are giving us leaders that aren't worth anything, and the kids coming out are a whole bunch of whiny snowflakes. So this is huge. And then you've got that continuing blowout or blowback, backlash even, in relation to Rip Curl. And the huge number, not just of female surfers speaking out, furious that women are being erased from campaigns to get women to buy surfing gear, but a whole lot of people who previously bought stuff from Rip Curl are burning it, throwing it away. They're putting that vision up on their social media feed. I mean, they're angry, aren't they?
There is a very clear message here for our universities, for our big corporates, and that message is go woke, go broke. We are seeing it play out right now. So first on the university issue and Harvard, it is extraordinary and so disappointing that it took the atrocities that Hamas inflicted on Israel to really show big donors, wealthy individuals, how sick our university sector has become. And it's good to see them now pushing back and withdrawing their funding, but it shouldn't have taken the appalling attacks on Israel to encourage them to actually stand up to these institutions and get everything back to where it should be. And I just want to quickly thank the Australian Jewish Association for my Israel Australia flag that I'm wearing tonight, Peter. On the Rip Curl issue, it's the same thing. Go woke, go broke. Women are finally, I'm so pleased to see women finally pushing back against a big corporate. We're usually too polite. We haven't done it in the past. But in the past week, women and men have said to Rip Curl, we don't want to see transgender women being prioritised over real women. Rip Curl allegedly sacked pro surfer Bethany Hamilton, who lost her arm at the age of 13 to a shark, came back, became one of our most successful female surfers around the globe. She was allegedly sacked by Rip Curl, and then a month later or so, they're promoting a transgender woman in WA to promote their products. So the message could not be more clear. Go woke, go broke. All of us out here are absolutely sick of it. And if the corporates want to keep doing it, Woolies again, Australia Day, same thing. We will all push back, and we will vote with our pockets and our money.
I got to go. Andrew Boldy's knocking at the door. But Phil, have a good week when Parliament's back next week. We'll speak again soon. Thank you, Nicole Flint. Thank you, my Sky News family. I couldn't do it without you. See you next Monday at 6.